Hey everyone, Cleo here, and today we're going over the best books of 2021. So my best books of the year and my worst books of the year videos are coming up. I'm doing the best ones first because I just love talking about the best ones first. So today I'm going to be going through them. I will admit that I kind of procrastinated on this video a bit this year because I'm ranking it. All other years I've just gone like, hey, these are the top 10 or something like that, and they're interchangeable. This year I'm making a final decision on which one is the best and which one is like just a little bit under the best. Do know that the top 3 in particular, but the top 7 actually, are all super good books that definitely deserve a best book of the year title. And within those top 7, the top 3 have a special place in my heart. And within those top 3, I decided that the first one has the most special place in my heart, let's say it like that. So, final caveat before we dive into the video is that I'm not including rereads within this list. I reread books that I really love, so they are like automatic 5-star reads almost upon reread, though that's not always the case, of course, but I decided that I'm not going to include any type of reread neither. So let's just do it, let's just dive in. So in 2021, these are the best books that I read. Number 10. On number 10 we have We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer, which is a non-fiction about climate change. In this one we are kind of looking at individual action, which individual actions can we take in order to help stall climate change. And the way that he does it, I feel, is very accessible. He very much is not trying to make you make all of the changes. He's not trying to shame you about the way that you live your life or shame you about the amount of action that you might be willing to take. He is very much arguing in favor of looking at what is manageable for you. Look at your lifestyle, look at what you are doing, and see which small changes you might be willing to make. And while, of course, a lot of skeptics react to that saying, yeah, but that's not enough, his idea is very much that small changes lead to more changes. If you take that first step, after a while you might see that you are willing to take another step as well. Also, a lot of people taking these individual actions does have at least some impact, and it might also mean that politicians feel more willing to take action because they see that the people are more willing to undergo these changes. A big part of this book also dives into why we are not treating climate change as the crisis that it actually is, and I found that part of the book also to be very interesting. Another interesting aspect to this book is that he has a sort of like inner monologue with his hesitant self. So basically his sort of like idealistic self who wants to make all of these changes goes into dialogue with his more hesitant self to try and find a compromise, to try and see, okay, but what is keeping you from making this change? What is the reason why you wouldn't go there? And so I found that section to be interesting as well. So I very much found this one to be a very accessible climate change book, and I definitely would recommend you check it out. In the number 9 spot, a pandemic book. The Last Man by Mary Shelley is a classic from the 19th century, probably one of the first pandemic books ever written. This is a book that basically starts pre-pandemic. I basically have been explaining it as if let's start the story of COVID-19 in 2019 with few people dealing with their very ordinary lives, and then one day their entire world is shaken up by a pandemic. When starting this read, you really have no sort of like indication of where this book is going to go. The first half of this novel almost feels like a sort of like political drama. What I very much found interesting about this book is the way in which it links to our current pandemic, but also looking at the changes with her vision of what would happen in a future pandemic versus our reality. A lot of things are the same, so a lot of the reactions, for example, she's talking about how politicians are kind of like running behind the facts about how there is wariness within the public where they don't want to kind of follow the rules that the politicians are setting and things like that. But of course, a big game changer in terms of the way that this pandemic rolls out in her book is vaccinations. There is no potential cure. There is no idea of there ever being a cure. Nobody is looking for a way to cure it. In this particular book, the only way to kind of stop the pandemic would be to find a way to stop its spread. And that's of course very different from the way that we can tackle our pandemic. But because of these differences and these similarities with our current pandemic life, I very much thought about this book a whole lot since reading it. I think it's a very interesting one. She's very much known for Frankenstein, but I think The Last Man definitely also deserves a read. In the number 8 spot, we have another non-fiction, and that is Disfigured by Amanda Leduc. This is a book about the representation of disability within mainly fairy tales, but she does also touch upon, for example, superhero movies within the scope of this book. Within this book, she will mainly be talking about the way that disability is represented within fairy tales, how the storylines of fairy tales very much establish these sort of like formulas for disability representations. The formula in which the sort of like perfect happy ending for somebody with a disability is to take away that disability, and indicating that we still see these structures very much pervasive throughout modern day representation for disability. Most of the storylines that we nowadays see for disability are either not told from the perspective of a disabled character themselves, or they kind of perpetuate this idea that the only happy ending for a disabled person is the end of disability. Or if that is not a possibility, we basically just have this sort of like grumpy, bitter disabled person as our leads. Throughout this text, she also interweaves a lot of personal experiences as well, which I definitely thought were an enrichment to the story. They very much gave life and gave a heart to this academic exploration. Moving into my top 7, as I said in the beginning, these 7 are all books that I definitely think like are top of the line, and I would highly recommend them. The differences between them are very slight, they're very personal, they're very much linked to what in particular I took away from certain reads, for example, and my ranking of those could definitely also change from one day to the other. So on number 7 we have a continuation of a series. So we have the 3rd book in A Course of Dragons, The Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. Now, putting a 3rd book on here does not mean that the other books in the series are not worthwhile. This is just my favorite in the series so far. I have read books 1 to 4 within 2021, and The Memory of Souls is my favorite in the series so far. So this is a book in A Course of Dragons, as I indicated, in which we are following a couple of characters who are basically linked to this sort of prophecy that says that they will kind of end the world, basically. And so we start out the story with Kieran, who is in the wrong place at the wrong time, but through his presence there, his secret identity is revealed and he is taken in by his original royal family. But being taken in by royalty is apparently not a happy life. The series very much has a unique structure in which we have different layers to the story. The entire book is always a report that is written to a certain person. And the report then contains 2 narrations that are telling a story from alternate perspectives or even alternate timelines. The Memory of Souls, as I said, 3rd book within the series, so I'm not going to dive specifically into why this is my favorite, but it just was a culmination of everything. I think the 1st book very much centers on one character, the 2nd book very much centers on another character, and in this we kind of very much have the assembly cast feeling. We have our characters together, we have the dynamics of all of our characters together. There's so much family drama as well within this one in particular, and this is definitely the one in which we start to see most of the polyamory rep in the series that we have so far up until that point. In books 1 and 2, we're kind of having a teasing of that rep, and in book 3, we're finally getting down to business a little bit more. It is a great and fun ride. It has a whole lot of queer rep in it as well. And while I know that the 1st book in particular can be very confusing and that some of that confusion just stays around until the end, I feel like, I definitely think that it is a great fun ride, and I'm rereading these books in 2022 now, and I'm very eager to see if some of that complexity can be resolved if I reread it now. If some of that confusion is going to go down with me rereading it and paying more attention to the parts that I know that I struggle with later on within the series. The number 6 spot goes to Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. This is a book that I did not really know what to expect of before going into it. I'd actually heard some mixed things about it, but overall I was hearing mainly positive things, and my experience with this book definitely was highly positive. So in this one we are following Eleanor, who's basically this sort of like recluse. From the beginning of this book, it's clear that she has a sort of like very weird, different relationship with her mother. Very much seems like her mother is a sort of like overbearing, controlling person, and that while Eleanor to some extent wants to distance herself from her mother because something has happened in the past that we don't really know what, she is also very much dependent upon her mother, and the relationship between the two is definitely toxic. But so outside of her mother, Eleanor doesn't really seem to have a lot of contact with the people around her. She is a little bit sort of like socially inept in the sense that the way that she reacts to people is, different from the norm. A lot of us know how to react in social environments. We know what is expected and we act accordingly. Eleanor on her side doesn't really understand social norms, or she doesn't really have the same sort of idea about what she should be saying. And as a result, she has a very unique way of reacting to things, and people are very much kind of startled or taken aback by her approach. Now, her sort of like status as a recluse is endangered when somebody in her neighborhood starts to pay attention to her and kind of wants to start a friendship. And one day they kind of help out this man who has an accident out on the street, and as a result they're kind of forced into each other's company a little bit more. And throughout the book we then see Eleanor opening up a little bit more as she's exposed more to social situations, as she's exposed more to being in groups or being around people. This one is definitely a fun and a heartbreaking one. I thought a whole lot of it was great fun and was just like, you know, really interesting to read and interesting to see how she was tackling the things that were happening around her, her view on life, her view on social events, and her way of tackling these things, which was very much a fresh eye that you got on certain things that we take for granted, for example. But this book is definitely divided in like good days, bad days, better days, I think, and the bad days section definitely was a hard read as well. But this book definitely also has a sort of like therapy session, and I definitely felt like I was taking that therapy session myself with the emotions that I was going through within this book. Highly recommend it. Then in the number 5 spot we go for Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. This was somewhat of a surprise to me in the sense that I thought Assassin's Apprentice was good. I thought it was decent, it's held up, it was great even, but it wasn't like a favorite, or it wasn't one that like automatically pushed me into reading the sequel, which is definitely clear by the fact that, you know, it took me 2 years to continue. I had to reread Assassin's Apprentice basically to be able to continue because it had been such a long time since I actually started that series. But I did also have some hope for Royal Assassin, because part of the reason why I didn't like absolutely love Assassin's Apprentice is its length, because endings for me are very important. An ending can make or break a book. And with Assassin's Apprentice, I just felt like that second half of the storyline was rushed. Like we didn't take our time with that storyline the way we had taken our time with the first half of the book. And knowing that Royal Assassin was like twice the length of Assassin's Apprentice definitely gave me hope, and hope that was warranted. And not just because it's length, because Assassin's Quest, the third book within the series, is then kind of disappointment, because even though that's even longer, there I just felt we took too much time. With Royal Assassin, it was just like the perfect pacing for me, and the themes and the plot lines and all of those just really worked for me, and the ending is so perfect within Royal Assassin. So within Royal Assassin, I felt things to an extreme. I was so emotionally invested within Royal Assassin that this one just had to be on this list. I didn't necessarily love Fitz within book 1, but within book 2, even though I wouldn't say that I like objectively love Fitz, clearly I do have a strong attachment to him because I definitely emotionally felt everything that he was going through. I also severely disliked, hated a character within this book, and the fact that she can make me feel such big hate for a character also highly speaks to Robin Hobb's writing. So in Assassin's Apprentice, we are basically following Fitzgerald's chivalry, who is the bastard son to nobility, basically the bastard son to the heir to the throne. When his status as a bastard is revealed, his father has to kind of take a step aside because his reputation is now severely damaged. But Fitz, regardless, is brought up within the royal household, he is brought up within the keep, and when he ages up a little bit, he is prepared to become an assassin. Robin Hobb's books are very much more character-focused reads than they are plot-driven books, so definitely do know that going into it, there is a whole lot of time taken with the storyline. So if you appreciate faster plots more, then this probably is not for you. But if you are somebody who enjoys slow plot development, who enjoys authors really diving into the emotional world and the inner world of the characters, then this one definitely is one for you to explore. In the number 4 spot, we get to The Pastor of Istanbul by Elif Shafak. This was somewhat of a surprise for me because I had read an Elif Shafak previously, so I had read 10 minutes and 38 seconds in This Strange World, which I enjoyed, but I had like a dual experience with that one. I really loved the second part of that book, but I kind of struggled with the first half of that book. And would I have picked up another Elif Shafak if it hadn't been for the fact that I got this one in a subscription box? I don't know. Hopefully I would, because this one was so amazing that now I'm definitely wanting to read more of her work. So in the Pastor of Istanbul, we're basically looking at the conflicts between Turkey and Armenia. We're looking at the Turkish-Armenian War, and we're looking at kind of the two sides of the conflicts. The story starts off with a young woman who goes to a clinic to get an abortion. However, when they start the procedure, it really hurts immensely and they kind of cannot continue on with it, so they ask her to kind of come back for it, but she then decides against it. She then decides that she is going to keep the child after all. And throughout the majority of this book, we are following her family of mainly women, because there's kind of this curse, it seems, on the family where all of the men die very young. They die at a very young age, and so the only male member left of this family has basically kind of escaped to America to kind of escape his fate, I guess. And we are mainly following this sort of household of like 4, I think, kind of eccentric women. I found this to be a very interesting read, a very immersive read as well. There is so much references to food and to certain cultural aspects that I really felt like I was in Istanbul while reading it. I very much love how you can get so immersed in the culture of a book just through the food that is being represented. And I definitely think that Elif Shafak is very good in sort of like ingraining her books with the culture. So yeah, very much loved this one. Learned a lot about the Turkish-Armenian incident as well. Very much loved that we were looking at it from both sides and not in the sense of it being a he said, she said type of story, though it definitely in parts is, but trying to find a reconciliation between those two sides. So if you're more of a general fiction reader and you haven't tried out Elif Shafak, this is one that I would recommend starting with. We're getting down to the wire. We're diving into the top 3. As I said at the very beginning as well, these are like the top. These are the 3 that when I first started thinking about this video, these were the 3 that came into mind immediately. So in spot 3, we're putting She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This book, it pains me to see people read this book because there are so many people who like don't dislike this book but are somewhat disappointed by this book, whereas this book is everything that I could wish for and it's everything that I wanted this book to do. So apparently there's a lot of misleading with the marketing for this book. So the story starts off with us following Ju Chong-pa, who is this girl who is brought up in poverty. Her brother and her father kind of treat her as their sort of like household slave. She doesn't really have a lot of prospects within her life, but she is definitely somebody who has a lot of ambition. And when they go to a fortune teller, the fortune teller tells her brother that he will be destined for greatness, and she tells Ju that she has no future, that there is nothing in her future. However, shortly after that, her father and her brother are killed in a raid, and she takes on her brother's identity in order to survive. Her brother's name is the key to getting into a monastery where she can at least have security for a time. And whereas initially her use of her brother's name allows her to survive, it will also feed into her ambition and her wishes to steal his future, to steal his destiny. Now, I really love this book a whole lot. It is marketed as Mulan meets The Song for Achilles. I have not read The Song for Achilles, so I cannot speak to that part. For the Mulan part, the fact that what they're referring to is the fact that it is Chinese setting and the fact that there is a gender swap within this one. But what I found really interesting about this one is that it isn't just a story about a girl taking on a boy's name in order to do boy stuff. And so it isn't just a story about like girls can do everything that boys can just as easily if they're just given the opportunity. Within this one, we take the gender swap idea in order to examine the gender binary, in order to establish a very complicated relationship that Ju develops to her gender. At a certain point in this book, she no longer feels like a girl pretending to be a boy. She doesn't feel like a boy neither. She feels like she's somewhere in between. She's something different altogether. This book is a fantasy book, but part of the reason why a lot of people are also disappointed with this read is that it does not have a lot of fantasy elements to it. This is definitely a historical fantasy to begin with, but the fantasy elements, at least in this first one, are definitely quite slim. There are definitely a few fantasy elements. There are some ghosts in here, for example, but there's also this sort of magical link to power. Basically, to be the ruler of this kingdom, you have to have this sort of like magical power. Interestingly enough, it is said that it comes from the heavens and that it's kind of the heaven's blessing to say like this is the one that needs to rule this kingdom. However, it turns out that there are multiple people within this book who actually have this power, and so who could make a claim for the throne. I have a big fascination with Chinese history as well. I did study a year of Chinese at university, and this one is also so ingrained with Chinese culture. There's so many things that I could relate back to what I had learned about Chinese culture that aren't necessarily explained within this one, which also kind of explain the reason why I loved it so much, because I could see all of those deeper layers within this story. But I definitely still think it's a great read. I think that if you go into it with the correct expectations, then this one is a great read. So I just hope that the more awareness is created about what this book actually is, the more that people will start to love it. But definitely a whole lot of people have also loved it the way that I have. It just pains me every time that I see somebody who doesn't like it because they were expecting something else. So I just want to set the record straight on this book. In the number 2 spot, we have Human Acts by Han Kang. So this is a historical fiction. It is quite experimental to some extent, because in this one we are following the events that take place in the Gwangju uprising. This is an uprising that took place in Korea. This is an uprising that was mainly led by the student body, but also included some, for example, some factory workers. And this was an uprising that was heavily beaten down by the Korean military. So in this story we are following kind of 8 perspectives as they go through this uprising and beyond that. It's very brutal, visceral representation of the events taking place, so do know that going in. You will be exposed to that pretty early on, because the first chapter already, the first perspective already has some descriptions of decomposing bodies, for example, and you were definitely not spared in that. It's definitely portrayed very graphically. This is definitely a difficult read in that sense, but it's also a very important read. And I definitely felt a whole lot of emotional investment, even though all of the perspectives are very limited. This is a short book in and of itself, and you follow each character for a very short period of time, but you do get such emotional investment because of the scope of the events, because of the brutality of the events. You really feel deeply for these characters and what they're going through. So definitely the majority of the book dives into the uprising itself and looks at different experiences of people during the uprising, or dealing with these sort of like immediate after effects of the uprising, you know, being taken into camps, for example, and the treatment they had there. And then in the final part of the book, we also dive into some perspectives that are taking place a lot later. For example, like 30 years later, the censorship that still surrounds these events. And then the final chapter, we are looking at the perspective of the author herself, of Han Kang herself, and we kind of see her link to this story and the reason why she decided to write this story. Very much love this one. I mean, love the saying, love is a weird word to use when it comes to this book, because obviously it is a very difficult, brutal, hard read. It's not fun read, it's not a light read, but it's definitely one that had a big impact. It's an event that I didn't know anything about. I had never heard of the Gwangju uprising, and I'm very happy that I got to read this book and got to explore this event in such an interesting way. And then it's time, guys, time to dive into my favorite read for 2021, and that is going to be Master of Sorrows by Justin Call. Master of Sorrows is a book that has been stood on my shelves for 2 years. I basically bought it very shortly after it was released, and it stood around on my shelves. I was never prioritizing it, you know, like many of us. I have so many books and only so little time, until Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction picked it up, and she mentioned that there was a trigger warning for ableism within this one. And I was like, oh, ableism? So this book is going to dive into disability, and I've been wanting to read more disability rep, especially I want to read more disability rep within fantasy, so this one immediately went to the top of my reading list, and I'm so grateful that I did, because I absolutely love this book. So in this one we are following our protagonist Anef, who is this young boy who was born with just one hand. However, in the society in which he grows up, that is a death sentence. Literally, as they try to kill him when he's just a baby. However, his life is saved by a local priest who finds him this magic prosthetic that allows him to go through life as if he is able-bodied and train amongst the other boys within the society to become part of this academy. The book has many elements that a lot of us fantasy readers love, such as a magic school setting, such as a trial. There's also prophecy involved. We also do learn more about the mythology of this world within this one, for example. But the main reason that this goes to my number 1 spot for this year is its disability representation. As indicated earlier when discussing Disfigured, there is a certain storyline that is laid out for disabled characters, and in fantasy a lot of times that means that the storyline of a disabled character ends up in a magical cure. And this book does not do that. This book has positive disability representation. We see Anev, who has been able to lead a normal life because of the use of a magical prosthetic. So I already like that fantasy element where we take a real world mobility tool and the author kind of then imagines the way that we can enhance mobility tools, not just in terms of Anev's hand. There is a later occurrence within this book as well where we see magic being of use to somebody with a disability. And because of the use of this mobility tool, he does not need a cure. Because of the ableism inherent in the society in which he grows up, we of course dive into the thematic a whole lot throughout this book, and I cannot really dive into a whole lot when it comes to why I love the disability representation within this book, because of spoilers of course. I do at some point want to make a video about the disability representation within this one, but I kind of have to figure out how to do that without spoiling the book. But so, absolutely love this one, cried with this one because of the positive disability representation, and regardless of the disability representation, it's also a great read without that. I know a whole lot of people love this book who don't even mention a lot about the disability representation within their reviews of this one. So it's definitely doing a whole lot more than just discussing disability within this one, and definitely when we get into the second book, disability takes a little bit of a back burner. I'm hoping we're going to dive into it a little bit more again in later books, but so in the second one, for example, we definitely open up the world a whole lot more, open up the complexity of the magic and all of those things as well. This is the first book in what is supposed to be a 12-book series. The author has already indicated that the goal of this series is to kind of slowly turn Anev from the sort of like cinnamon roll character that he is at the beginning of the series to the evil force that he is prophesied to become. So if you have no interest in the disability rep side of things, then maybe that will be the reason why you pick up this book, because I absolutely encourage you to do so, because this one is definitely worth it. But so yeah, those were my favorite books of 2021. And I can only hope that in 2022 I'll stumble across some other amazing reads that I'll be just as excited to talk about at the end of the year as I was about these ones. But so let me know what your favorite book of the year was. If you've read any of these books, definitely also let me know what your thoughts were on them. Don't hesitate to mention if you didn't like a book on my list. It will kind of break my heart a little bit, but I'm always interested to see a contrasting opinion to mine about certain of the books that I absolutely love or that I absolutely hate. So my worst books of the year video is definitely also going to be coming your way. I should be filming it today as well so that it comes out only a few days after this one, hopefully. But we all know that I like to procrastinate, so we'll see whether that ends up happening. But it's definitely my intention, so be on the lookout for that. It's coming your way shortly. But with that in mind, time for me to wrap up this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this and see you guys for the next one. Bye!